Christmas, a time for joy, laughter, and cherished memories. But what if your holiday cheer turned into a nightmare you could never escape? What if, instead of gifts, you received terror wrapped in darkness? This is the story of how Christmas became my season of fear. Forever, the snow fell like a quiet curtain outside the window, its soft whispers the only sound in an otherwise still night. I could feel the cold creeping in through the cracks of the tiny cottage, wrapping itself around me like a heavy blanket. Christmas Eve wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to feel wrong. Daryl's hand squeezed mine as the car rolled up to his parents' home. The cottage stood isolated in a field of endless white, surrounded by nothing but the haunting stillness of the countryside. I remember thinking how picturesque it all seemed at first glance, a Christmas postcard come to life. But there was something off about it, to something I couldn't name yet, but could feel deep in my chest. It's cozy, right? Daryl's voice broke my thoughts. I forced a smile. Yeah, cozy. But that feeling wouldn't leave me. When his parents stepped outside to greet us, the warmth I expected wasn't there. Their smiles froze the second they saw me. It was subtle but unmistakable. I could see it in the way their faces stiffened, how their eyes darted to Daryl and then back to me like I was some unwelcome guest. You must be her, his mother said, her voice as tight as her forced grin. I extended my hand, trying to brush off the unease. Hi, I'm glad to finally meet you both. They didn't shake my hand. They didn't even pretend to. We stepped inside, the warmth of the fireplace doing little to melt the chill that settled in my gut. The house smelled like pine and gingerbread, yet it felt cold, as if the walls themselves disapproved of me. Dinner was awkward, to say the least. His parents asked polite questions, but there was something calculated about the way they spoke, like they were looking for cracks in my story. So, do you cook? His mother asked, her knife slicing through the turkey with precision. Sometimes, I said. I love experimenting with recipes. She sniffed, unimpressed. That's nice, I suppose. Daryl chuckled nervously, trying to fill the silence. But I noticed how he avoided looking me in the eye, like he knew this wasn't going well. After dinner, his mother handed me a dish towel. You don't mind doing the dishes, do you? It's house rules. I glanced at Daryl, hoping he'd say something. He didn't. I forced another smile. Of course, I don't mind. The night stretched on, each moment heavier than the last. By the time they showed me to the guest room separate from Daryl's room, of course, I was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with the long drive. It's just how we do things, his father said, his tone making it clear there was no room for discussion. I nodded, biting back the sharp words on the tip of my tongue. When I finally settled into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The cottage was old, and the doors didn't have locks, just slits in the wood that let the dim hallway light filter through. I considered moving a piece of furniture in front of the door, but decided against it. Daryl might sneak in later, I thought. The room was suffocatingly silent, the kind that presses against your ears until you start hearing things. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the footsteps I heard outside my door were probably just Daryl going to the bathroom. But when they stopped right in front of my door and didn't move for what felt like an eternity, my chest tightened. Daryl, I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer. I stayed frozen under the covers, every muscle in my body locked in place. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, but sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was restless, broken by the creaks and groans of the house that seemed far too loud for a place so small. Christmas morning didn't bring relief. If anything, it was worse. I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth when the door swung open. Oh, sorry, Daryl's father said, his tone void of apology. I stared at him, toothpaste foaming in my mouth, my heart racing. Can you close the door, please? He didn't move right away. He stood there for a moment too long, his eyes lingering before he finally pulled the door shut. "Don't forget to flush twice," he called out as he walked away, his laughter echoing down the hall. I swallowed hard, feeling exposed in a way I couldn't explain. The day dragged on with more awkward conversations and thinly veiled insults from his parents. By the time night fell, I was counting down the hours until I could leave. But that night, that's when it happened. The footsteps came back, slow, deliberate, like whoever it was wanted me to hear them. They stopped at my door again, just like the night before. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the faint slits of light, waiting for anything to happen. And then, the doorknob turned. "Daryl." I whispered, louder this time, still no answer. The door didn't open, but I could hear breathing on the other side. Shallow, raspy, and far too close. I didn't dare move. I didn't even breathe. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours before the footsteps retreated. The next morning, I told Daryl about it, but he brushed it off. "It's probably just my dad. He sleepwalks sometimes." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I wanted to leave, but I didn't have my car, and Daryl refused to leave early. Something wasn't right in that house, and I was beginning to think I might not make it out. The morning after Christmas should have felt peaceful, but the air in that house seemed thicker than before. Every sound echoed louder, every glance lingered longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. Daryl's parents sat in the living room, his mother knitting while his father stared into the fire. The orange glow flickered across his face, casting shadows that made his expression unreadable. Daryl tried to lighten the mood, suggesting we take a walk in the snow. "Fresh air will help," he said, but I wasn't sure if he meant for me or him. We bundled up and stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath our boots. The cold stung my face, but it was a relief to be out of that house. The world was quiet except for the occasional rustling of bare tree branches in the wind. As we walked, I tried to bring up the strange things I'd experienced. "Last night, someone was at my door again. I know you said your dad sleepwalks, but, Daryl, it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate." He stopped walking, his breath visible in the icy air. "You're overthinking it. My parents can be weird, but they're harmless." "Harmless?" I scoffed. "Your dad barged into the bathroom, and your mom's been treating me like I'm an intruder." "And those footsteps, Daryl. I'm not imagining this," he sighed, running a gloved hand through his hair. "Look, it's just one more night. We'll leave tomorrow, I promise." I wanted to believe him, but a part of me knew that wasn't going to be enough. When we returned to the house, Daryl's parents were still in the living room, but now they were whispering to each other. They stopped as soon as we walked in. His mother glanced at me, her lips tightening into a thin line. That evening, the tension reached a breaking point. During dinner, his mother finally said what I suspected she'd been holding back. "You don't belong here," she said bluntly, her fork clinking against her plate. "Mom," Daryl said, his voice sharp. "No, she needs to hear this. You're not right for him." I've tried to be polite, but enough is enough. I stared at her, stunned. I didn't come here to cause trouble. I came here because Daryl asked me to. And that was his mistake, his father added, his tone cold. Daryl slammed his hands on the table. "That's enough." The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fireplace. I excused myself, retreating to the guest room, but the argument echoed in my ears. I felt trapped, not just in the house, but in a situation I couldn't escape. Night fell, and with it came the dread I'd been carrying all day. The guest room felt smaller, the walls closer. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but there was no signal, no way to reach out. Then came the footsteps again. This time, they were heavier, slower. They stopped outside my door like before, but this time, there was no hesitation. The doorknob turned, and the door creaked open just enough for the light from the hallway to spill in. "Daryl," I whispered, my voice barely audible. No answer. I froze, clutching the blanket as if it could shield me. The door opened wider, and there he was, Daryl's father, standing in the doorway. He wasn't sleepwalking. His eyes were wide open, fixed on me, and he was completely naked. My scream tore through the silence. "Get out!" I shouted, throwing a pillow at him. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring, his breath shallow and ragged. Within seconds, Daryl appeared, shoving his father back and slamming the door shut. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Daryl yelled, his voice trembling. His father muttered something I couldn't make out, then shuffled down the hall. Daryl turned to me, his face pale. "I'm so sorry. He really does sleepwalk. I'll talk to him. I'll fix this." But I didn't believe him, not anymore. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the room, every muscle in my body tense. The morning after what happened with Daryl's father felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I hadn't slept a single minute, my body frozen with fear, every creak in the house sending waves of panic through me. Daryl barely said a word when he came to check on me in the morning, his face pale and full of guilt. But I didn't care about his excuses anymore. The trust I'd had for him, no matter how little it had been, was gone. We ate breakfast in silence. Daryl's parents were no longer pretending to be civil. His mother avoided eye contact, and his father didn't even bother to sit at the table. He just stood by the window, staring outside with a distant look in his eyes. "I think it's time to go," I said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between us like an unbearable weight. My voice sounded foreign, thick with emotion. Daryl looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Please, just one more night, we can leave in the morning." But I couldn't stay another minute in that house with them. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. "No, Daryl, I'm leaving now. I don't care what you say." I grabbed my coat and walked toward the door. Daryl's voice followed me, desperate and strained. "Don't leave like this, please." I paused just before stepping outside, my hand on the door frame. "You're not the person I thought you were." And then I left. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it was a relief to feel the sting of it on my skin. I started walking, not knowing where I was going, just needing to get away. The snow crunched beneath my boots, but there was no sign of life anywhere. No one on the road, no cars passing by, just the emptiness of the countryside. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs aching from the cold. But eventually, I saw a small, dimly lit farmhouse in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was a sign of life, and that was all I needed. I knocked on the door, my heart racing, praying for someone to answer. When the door opened, I nearly collapsed into the arms of the stranger who greeted me. He was an older man, his face withered by time and hardship. "You okay, miss?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. I don't know, I need help." He let me inside, and I sat by the fire, my body shaking as the warmth began to seep in. He gave me some tea, his eyes watching me closely as I drank. "Do you know anything about the old cottages around here?" I asked, still trying to make sense of everything. He nodded slowly. There's something strange about that place. Some say it's cursed." I stared at him, my pulse quickening. "Cursed?" He didn't answer immediately, instead glancing at the fire. "People don't go near it anymore." "Not since the old days." I shuddered, my thoughts racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me in that house, something far worse than I could have imagined. "Where is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes sad. "You don't want to go there, miss." "I have to," I said, my voice firm despite the fear clawing at my chest. "I need to know what's going on." With a reluctant sigh, he gave me directions. But before I left, he said one last thing. "Be careful. If you go back, don't let them lure you inside. Once you're in, you may not come out." His warning echoed in my mind as I left the farmhouse and began my walk back toward the cottage. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was still thick with a sense of unease. The house loomed ahead, silent and waiting. As I approached the cottage, I saw something moving in the window shadows. Figures. I felt a cold, heavy hand settle on my chest, but I couldn't turn back now. The door opened slowly, creaking on its hinges as if it had been expecting me. Daryl stood there, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him, his eyes wide with fear. Behind him, I could see his parents, watching me with strange, almost predatory stares. "I told you not to leave," Daryl said softly, his voice shaking. I backed away, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorframe to steady myself. "What's going on here?" "Daryl." His face twisted into something I didn't recognize. "You're not supposed to leave." Before I could react, his parents stepped forward, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "No one leaves," his father murmured, his voice low and hypnotic, "not without permission." I didn't understand what was happening, but the air around me seemed to thicken, like I was suffocating. The cottage felt like a trap, and I was caught in it. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind me, and everything went dark. The darkness that engulfed me was suffocating, the kind that presses against your skin and makes you question if you're even alive. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air in the cottage was thick, heavier than it had ever been. I could feel the presence of something ancient, something malicious, moving around me in the blackness. Daryl's voice cut through the silence, distorted and far away. "I told you, you shouldn't have left." I felt his hand on my shoulder, cold and clammy, and I jerked away, gasping for air. I tried to move, but the room seemed to stretch and warp, the walls closing in around me. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "What's happening?" Daryl's parents appeared in front of me, their faces twisted into something monstrous. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, their smiles widening far too much for any human to bear. They were no longer the people I'd met when I first arrived, they were something else entirely. "They warned you," Daryl's mother hissed, her voice now sharp and guttural. "But you didn't listen." My pulse raced, my throat tightening with fear. "What do you want from me?" "You belong here," his father's voice rumbled, low and menacing. "We've waited so long for you to arrive." "No," I screamed, stumbling backward. My foot hit something hard, something solid, and I turned to find the door, the same door I'd just entered, now covered in strange symbols I didn't recognize. I tried to force it open, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was holding me prisoner. "You don't understand," Daryl said, his voice barely audible. "You were never supposed to leave. You were never supposed to find out." I spun around to face him, my eyes wide with horror. "Find out what? What is this?" He stepped forward, his expression a mixture of sadness and desperation. "My family, they've been here for generations. We've made a deal with something that lives in the shadows, in the walls, in the very air we breathe. It needs a sacrifice every now and then." I staggered back, my mind reeling. "Sacrifice?" Daryl nodded, his eyes darkening. "I was supposed to be the one, but you were chosen instead." I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The words swirled around me like smoke, choking me, suffocating me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head in disbelief. "This can't be real. You're lying." He didn't respond. Instead, he reached out to me, his hand cold and clammy. "Please, don't make this harder than it has to be." Before I could react, I felt a coldness grip my body, seeping into my bones. It was the presence that had been haunting me all along, the thing that had been waiting in the shadows. It was now inside me, pulling me, suffocating me. I looked around frantically, searching for any way out. The room was spinning, the walls pressing in on me, and the symbols on the door were glowing brighter, pulsating with an eerie energy. Then, through the haze of fear and panic, I remembered the words the old man at the farmhouse had said, "Once you're in, you may not come out." I had been warned, but I hadn't listened. With a desperate scream, I pushed past Daryl, shoving him aside as I reached for the door again. But this time, it didn't just open, it shattered, splintering into pieces, as if the house itself was reacting to my defiance. The moment the door shattered, everything stopped. The coldness, the darkness, the pressure, all of it vanished in an instant. The house seemed to groan, as though it were alive, as though it were angry that I had escaped its grasp. I stumbled outside, the snow now falling gently around me, as if nothing had ever happened. The quiet of the countryside greeted me, the familiar stillness of the world that had once felt so eerie now seeming like a relief. I looked back at the cottage, but it was no longer there. Where it had once stood was now only an empty field, untouched by anything sinister. The house, the family, everything was gone. The terror that had consumed me slowly faded, leaving behind only annoying emptiness. I didn't know if I had escaped something alive or if I had merely been a part of some twisted dream. But I knew one thing for sure: I would never return.